Good evening. Tonight, we begin with a major development in the Middle East, where fresh reports suggest that Iran has responded to a U.S. ceasefire proposal with a strong and highly demanding counterposition. According to the latest reports, the United States recently sent a ceasefire plan to Iran through intermediaries, hoping to open a path toward de-escalation after a dangerous period of military tension and regional instability. But instead of giving a quick yes, Iran is now said to be pushing back with major conditions of its own. These reported demands are serious, wide-ranging, and politically explosive. They include the closure of American military bases in the Gulf, broad sanctions relief, compensation for wartime damage, and a new arrangement linked to the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most important shipping routes in the world. If these reports are accurate, this is no simple answer to a peace proposal. It is a direct attempt by Tehran to reshape the terms of any future deal and possibly the wider balance of power in the region. For now, there is no official final agreement, no confirmed breakthrough, and no sign that both sides are close to a common position. But what is clear is that this ceasefire discussion is becoming far more than just a question of stopping attacks. It is now also about military presence, regional influence, economic pressure, and control over a globally important waterway. And that is why this story matters far beyond the Middle East. Tonight, we will walk you through what is being reported, what it could mean, and why the world is watching so closely. At the center of the story is a reported U.S. effort to open negotiations through a ceasefire framework. The proposal, according to reports, was sent through intermediaries rather than through direct public negotiations. That in itself tells us something about the level of mistrust involved. This is not a case where Washington and Tehran are sitting face to face and speaking openly. This is diplomacy happening through channels, through messages, through signals, and through carefully managed contact. That kind of arrangement usually happens when tensions are high, when both sides want room to deny, delay, or reposition, and when the political cost of direct contact is still considered too high. But what has made this story especially dramatic is the reported Iranian response. Instead of a simple rejection, Iran is said to have answered with terms that go well beyond the immediate battlefield. Reports suggest Tehran wants American bases in the Gulf shut down. It wants sanctions removed. It wants compensation. It wants stronger guarantees against future attacks. And perhaps most controversially, it is linked in reports to a proposal involving the Strait of Hormuz, including possible control-related arrangements or fees for passage. Even by the standards of hard bargaining, these are major demands. To understand why, we need to slow down and look carefully at each part of this. Let's begin with the issue of U.S. military bases in the Gulf. The Gulf region has long been one of the most strategically sensitive parts of the world. American military facilities there are not just symbols. They are working hubs of power. They support surveillance, logistics, air operations, regional defense cooperation, and maritime security. They also send a broader political message that the United States maintains a military footprint in the region and intends to remain a key player in its security structure. From Washington's perspective, these bases are part of deterrence. They are part of alliance management. They are part of crisis response. And they are part of the military architecture that supports American interests across the broader Middle East. But from Tehran's perspective, those same bases may look very different. For Iran, U.S. bases close to its area of influence can be seen as a direct strategic threat. They can be viewed as launch points, pressure points, and permanent reminders of outside military power stationed near Iranian territory and near Iran's most important regional interests. So if Iran is now demanding that these bases be shut down, then it is not simply asking for a pause in violence. It is asking for a rollback of American military reach in the Gulf. That would be a very big deal. Such a condition would be extremely difficult for any U.S. administration to accept. It would affect relations not only with Iran, but also with Gulf partners that rely on American security cooperation. It would raise questions about deterrence, naval access, regional alliances, and the overall shape of power in the area. This is why the reported demand is being taken so seriously. Now let's look at the second major part of the story, sanctions relief. Sanctions have long been one of the main tools used by the United States and its partners to pressure Iran. These restrictions affect trade, finance, oil exports, and other parts of the Iranian economy. For Tehran, removing sanctions is not just an economic issue. It is a political issue, a sovereignty issue, and a question of long-term survival and leverage. Any serious negotiation involving Iran almost always includes the sanctions question in some form, because from Tehran's perspective, there can be no meaningful settlement if economic punishment continues unchanged. So if Iran is demanding sanctions relief as part of any ceasefire arrangement, that fits with its wider pattern of thinking. Tehran may be signaling that it will not accept a deal that only addresses military operations while leaving economic pressure fully intact. In other words, Iran may be saying, if you want calm, then you must offer more than silence on the battlefield. You must also change the conditions that help produce this confrontation in the first place. Then comes the issue of compensation. This, too, is deeply significant. If a state demands compensation during or after conflict negotiations, it is doing more than asking for money. It is making a statement about responsibility. It is effectively saying that damage was done, blame exists, and that any future arrangement must recognize both the cost and the cause of that damage. Compensation demands are politically sensitive because they touch the core question of who was wrong, who acted first, who escalated, and who now owes what to whom. In practical terms, compensation can be one of the hardest issues to resolve in diplomacy, because it is tied to narrative as much as to numbers. Governments do not just negotiate costs. They negotiate language, legitimacy, and historical memory. And then we come to the part of the story that may have the greatest global impact, the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most strategically important waterways in the world. It is narrow, but its importance is enormous. A large share of the world's oil and gas shipments move through this route. That means any tension there can quickly affect shipping, insurance, energy markets, global trade, and fuel prices around the world. This is why the Strait is never just a regional issue. It is a global economic issue. When there is tension in or around the Strait of Hormuz, energy traders react. Governments react. Oil companies react. Shipping firms react. Insurance markets react. Because everyone understands the same basic truth, if this narrow passage is threatened, the shock can travel everywhere. So the idea that Iran could seek some kind of special arrangement related to the Strait, including possible fees or stronger control, immediately raises alarm. To some, such a demand would look like a bargaining tactic. To others, it would look like a strategic warning. And to global markets, it would almost certainly look like risk. Why? Because if the movement of ships through the Strait becomes more expensive, more dangerous, more politically contested, or more tightly controlled, then the cost of energy and transport can rise fast. This is how a diplomatic dispute becomes a global inflation story. This is how a military crisis in one region can affect fuel prices, shipping schedules, manufacturing costs, and even household budgets in countries far from the Gulf. And that is why this development is being followed so closely. Now, beyond the reported demands themselves, there is another key issue tonight: trust. Or, more accurately, the near total absence of trust. Any ceasefire requires at least some minimum confidence that the other side will follow through. But in this case, mistrust appears to be everywhere. Washington and Tehran have a long history of hostility, failed diplomacy, accusations, pressure campaigns, and indirect confrontation. Even when talks begin, suspicion often remains stronger than confidence. And when that happens, each side tends to see every move by the other as tactical rather than sincere. This makes diplomacy extremely difficult. If the U.S. sends a ceasefire proposal, Iran may see it not as an honest peace effort, but as an attempt to freeze the situation on terms favorable to Washington. If Iran responds with tough demands, the U.S. squints. May see that not as a negotiating opening, but as an effort to exploit the crisis and expand leverage. That dynamic makes every message heavier, every condition sharper, and every delay more dangerous. And because this appears to be diplomacy through intermediaries, that adds another layer of uncertainty. Messages carried by intermediaries can open doors, but they can also create misunderstanding. Tone can be misread. Signals can be inflated. Conditions can be framed differently at each stage. And because the talks are indirect, public statements may not fully match private messages. So tonight, one of the biggest unknowns is this: are these reported Iranian demands a final hardened position, or are they opening bids in a much larger negotiation? That question matters because opening positions are often tough by design. In high-stakes diplomacy, governments rarely begin with their lowest demand. They begin high. They test reaction. They show strength. They leave room to move later if they choose. That may be what we are seeing here, or it may not. Because another possibility is that the gap between both sides is still simply too wide. One side may want de-escalation without major strategic concessions. The other may want de-escalation only if the regional power balance changes in a meaningful way. If that is the case, then a ceasefire could still be far away. Another important element in this story is the military backdrop. Reports indicate that while diplomatic messages were being passed, military preparations were also continuing. This is a familiar pattern in crisis diplomacy. States often negotiate while reinforcing. They talk while mobilizing. They signal openness while preparing for pressure. That may sound contradictory, but in strategic terms, it is often quite deliberate. Military pressure is used to strengthen negotiating leverage. Diplomatic outreach is used to test whether pressure can produce results. The risk, of course, is that both sides do the same thing at the same time. If both are reinforcing while also talking, then the possibility of miscalculation rises sharply. And in a region as sensitive as the Gulf, miscalculation can be extremely dangerous. It can affect military bases, shipping routes, energy facilities, and neighboring countries. That brings us to the wider regional picture. This is not a story that belongs only to Iran and the United States. It also involves the Gulf states, Israel, regional militias, energy exporters, maritime security forces, and mediating countries trying to prevent further escalation. Countries like Oman, Egypt, and Pakistan are being closely watched because they may serve as communication channels or diplomatic bridges. These states often play important roles in tense moments, especially when direct contact between rivals is politically difficult. But mediation only works if both sides believe some form of compromise is still possible. And right now, that remains unclear. The region itself has strong reasons to fear what comes next. Gulf countries may want security guarantees, but they do not want to become battle zones. Energy producers want exports protected, not disrupted. Shipping companies want clear routes, not rising threats. Mediators want calm, not widening conflict. And global markets want predictability, not sudden shocks. But if negotiations begin with demands this large, and if trust remains this low, then even the opening stage of talks can feel unstable. It is also worth noting that this crisis is not happening in a vacuum. Behind the ceasefire discussion lies a much larger struggle over regional order. Who will shape Gulf security? How much military presence should the United States retain? What role will Iran be allowed to play in the region? Can maritime routes remain open under current tensions? Can sanctions and deterrence coexist with diplomacy? And is this conflict about immediate ceasefire mechanics or about the long-term structure of power in the Middle East? These are the bigger questions hiding inside tonight's headline. Because when Iran reportedly asked for base closures and new arrangements in Hormuz, it is not just negotiating over today. It may be negotiating over the future map of influence. And that is one reason the story is so serious. Now let's consider the domestic political side for a moment. In Washington, any negotiation with Iran is politically sensitive. A ceasefire proposal can be presented as a responsible effort to reduce risk. But if it appears too soft, critics may say it rewards pressure or weakness. If it appears too hard, others may say it blocks diplomacy and raises the risk of wider war. That means U.S. leaders face a narrow path. They must show strength without closing off negotiation. They must seek calm without appearing to surrender strategic ground. Iran's leadership faces its own pressures. In Tehran, any sign of compromise can be seen by hardliners as dangerous. Any move that appears too conciliatory toward the United States could be politically costly. At the same time, economic pressure, military risk, and regional instability create incentives for diplomacy. So both sides may want a deal in theory, but each may fear looking weaker in practice. That is why public rhetoric often remains so hard, even when back-channel diplomacy is active. Leaders speak for audiences at home as well as abroad. They speak to rivals, to allies, to domestic factions, to military commanders, and to markets. And that means every statement has multiple targets. This helps explain why one side may publicly deny momentum while privately exchanging messages. It helps explain why diplomacy can exist even when both sides appear to be rejecting it. It also helps explain why news around such crises often develops in fragments. One report points to a proposal, another points to rejection, a third points to conditions, a fourth points to possible flexibility. All of that can be true at once in a tense negotiation. Because diplomacy is not always linear, especially in conflict, it often moves in circles, pauses, signals, pressure, and trial messages. Now let's come back to the global economic dimension because this cannot be overstated. If this confrontation touches the Strait of Hormuz in any serious way, the consequences could spread far beyond diplomacy. Even without a full closure, the perception of danger can change market behavior. Tankers may require more protection. Insurance premiums may rise. Shipping schedules may shift. Importers may begin looking for backup supply. Energy traders may price in future disruptions. Governments may prepare reserve measures. And consumers around the world may eventually feel the effect of fuel and transport prices. That is why every word linked to Hormuz matters. It is not just a place on a map. It is a pressure point in the global economy. And for that reason alone, any report that ties ceasefire negotiations to Hormuz immediately becomes international front-page news. Now, there is also another issue viewers should keep in mind tonight, the difference between reported demands and final terms. This distinction is very important. In moments of crisis, dramatic claims can move quickly. But not every reported condition becomes a formal negotiating term, and not every negotiating term becomes part of a final agreement. Sometimes governments float ideas to test reaction. Sometimes intermediaries carry messages that are only preliminary. Sometimes officials speak off the record. Sometimes media reports reflect real discussions but not settled positions. So while these reported Iranian demands are highly significant, it remains important to treat them as part of a developing picture, not as a final signed framework. That said, even as reported positions, they tell us a great deal. They suggest Iran wants to negotiate from strength. They suggest Tehran is linking military de-escalation to broader strategic and economic issues. They suggest any ceasefire, if it happens, may be tied to far more than the immediate conflict. And they suggest the road to agreement could be long and difficult. So where does this leave things tonight? At this moment, there are several possible paths ahead. One possibility is that these reported demands are opening positions and that quiet diplomacy continues behind the scenes. In that case, some conditions may soften over time. Some may be traded, and some may be reframed into formulas both sides can live with. A second possibility is that the demands are too large, the mistrust too deep, and the military climate too tense for real progress in the near term. In that case, the ceasefire effort may stall and the region could remain on edge. A third possibility is that diplomacy and deterrence continue side by side for some time, producing neither full war nor real peace, but a dangerous in-between period shaped by pressure, uncertainty, and repeated risk. And perhaps that is the most realistic reading tonight. Not peace, not collapse, but a tense contest over terms, a contest over who has leverage, a contest over who has leverage, a contest over what counts as security, a contest over who gets to shape the conditions of de-escalation. And that is why this story must be watched very carefully. Because when ceasefire talks are tied to base closures, sanctions, compensation, and a critical maritime choke point, the stakes are no longer narrow. They are regional, they are strategic, and they are global. Before we close, let's bring the full picture together one more time. The United States is reported to have sent a ceasefire proposal through intermediaries. Iran is reported to have answered with major demands, including U.S. base closures in the Gulf, sanctions relief, compensation, and a new framework linked to the Strait of Hormuz. There is no confirmed final agreement. There is still deep mistrust on both sides. Military pressure and diplomatic signaling appear to be happening at the same time. And the world is watching because the outcome could affect not only security in the Middle East, but also global shipping, energy markets, and international stability. For now, the central question is simple but deeply important. Are these reported demands the beginning of a real negotiation, or are they a sign that a ceasefire remains out of reach? Tonight, no one can answer that with confidence. But one thing is certain. This is no ordinary diplomatic exchange. This is a high-stakes moment involving power, pressure, territory, economics, and the future of security in one of the world's most sensitive regions. And until there is greater clarity, every new signal from Washington, Tehran, and the wider region will matter. That's all for now on this major developing story. We will continue to monitor the latest updates and bring you more as soon as new details emerge. Thank you for watching. Good night.